The marriage was a transaction of blood and dominion, conducted in the bone-chilling silence of the Great Hall. Princess Clara of the Sunken Valleys stood before Lord Julian, vampire king of the Night Peaks, a fragile specter in borrowed finery. The silks were the color of winter sky, a deliberate choice to wash out the gold of her hair and the warmth of her skin, to make her one with the cold stone and colder shadows of her new home. She was a living treaty, the final clause in a long and bitter war, and every soul, living and undead, in this hall looked at her as if she were the ink, still wet and easily smeared. Her value was conditional, her existence a constant, quiet reminder of the thousands of men who had died before her arrival made their deaths unnecessary. Julian was less a man than a monument to immortality itself, a chasm of ancient indifference carved into the shape of a king. He stood taller than any mortal she had ever seen, broad and unbreachable, his black hair falling past his shoulders in the style of centuries long dead. His face held no welcome, its perfection marred only by the supernatural stillness that marked his kind. No breath, no pulse of life beneath that marble skin. His eyes, the color of arterial blood dimmed to burgundy, passed over her without purchase, acknowledging her presence as one might acknowledge a meal delivered to the wrong address. Yet when those eyes met hers for the briefest instant during the vows, something flickered in their depths, gone so quickly she thought she'd imagined it. A flash of something almost like recognition. As if some part of his ancient, undead heart had stirred at the sight of her standing there, terrified and beautiful in her winter silks. He said his vows in a low, resonant voice that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly in her bones, the words precise and devoid of emotion. They were the terms of a contract, nothing more. When he placed the ring on her finger, a heavy band of blackened silver etched with ancient runes, his touch was corpse-cold and brief, a flicker of contact that promised nothing and offered less. But his fingers lingered, just a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if some instinct he'd long forgotten was trying to surface through centuries of practiced detachment. She was his, but she was not his concern. Not yet. The days that followed bled into one another, a watercolor wash of gray loneliness. She was given a suite of rooms in the quietest wing of Sanguine Keep, the fortress carved into the mountain's peak where the sun never quite reached the deepest shadows. The windows looked out over a sheer drop, a dizzying vista of perpetual twilight and jagged rock. It was a beautiful prison, impeccably appointed and utterly empty of warmth or life. Servants, pale, hollow-eyed thralls bound to the keep through blood magic, brought her meals on silver trays and left them by the door, their eyes always fixed on the floor, their mouths set in thin, disapproving lines. They performed their duties with a resentful efficiency that was more insulting than open hostility. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting corridors where her footsteps made no sound, a phantom queen in a court that refused to see her. What Clara didn't know was that Julian watched her. From the shadows, from the high balconies, through the ancient corridors of his keep, the vampire king found himself tracking the movement of his mortal bride with an attention that disturbed him. He had ruled for over 7 centuries. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had loved once, long ago in his mortal life, and had spent the subsequent centuries convinced that such feeling had died with his beating heart. He had accepted this treaty bride as a political necessity, nothing more. But there was something about the way she moved through his fortress, quiet and careful, yet unbowed. The way she held her head high even when the court turned their backs. The way she sought refuge in his library, running her fingers over ancient texts with a reverence that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge. He found himself standing in the darkened alcoves, watching her read by candlelight, her face soft with concentration, her lips moving slightly as she traced the words of vampire histories and blood magic grimoires that should have terrified her. She was supposed to be just another mortal, fragile, temporary, beneath his notice. Instead, she was becoming an obsession. He told himself it was simply the novelty. The strangeness of having something so alive, so warm, so vibrantly mortal in his domain of eternal night. Her heartbeat was a constant song in his enhanced hearing, a rhythmic reminder of everything he'd lost. Her scent, jasmine and something uniquely her, lingered in the corridors long after she'd passed. He told himself this fascination would fade. It didn't. The whispers were the worst part. They followed her like the ever-present mountain drafts, slithering from behind tapestries and around stone pillars. The Valley Princess. The blood tribute. Look at her, thin as a willow reed. Her mortal blood is too weak. She'll never bear a true vampire heir. The words were meant to be heard, tiny barbs intended to prick and bleed. The ladies of the court, lesser vampires clad in velvets and ancient jewels, their beauty frozen in the moment of their turning, would fall silent as she entered a room, their crimson eyes tracking her with a predatory stillness before they turned their backs, resuming their conversations with a pointed, exclusionary air. They judged her for the war her father had started, and for the peace her marriage had bought. In their eyes, she was both the sin and the unsatisfactory penance. A mortal among immortals, warm blood in a court of the eternally cold. Julian remained a distant, formidable presence. She saw him only at the evening gatherings in the great hall. Nights were when the court assembled and conducted official business, not because vampires needed darkness to function, but because tradition and caution kept them from being active during sunlight hours when they were vulnerable. The daylight hours were for private pursuits, study, meditation. Vampires didn't sleep, but even immortal minds needed periods of rest and reflection. Julian had spent 7 centuries in contemplative stillness during the day, standing at windows or sitting in profound meditation. But lately he'd found himself unable to settle into that state, too aware of Clara's presence somewhere in the keep, too attuned to the rhythm of her mortal life. At the evening gatherings, he sat at the head of the high table, a monolith of silent authority. He never spoke to her. He never looked at her, or so she thought. What she didn't see were the moments when she was distracted, when his burgundy eyes would find her face and linger there, studying the play of candlelight across her features, the way she bit her lower lip when she was anxious, the stubborn set of her jaw when she refused to let the court see her pain. He never drank in her presence, though the thirst was a constant companion for his kind. The crystal goblet before him remained untouched during these gatherings. He couldn't bear the thought of her seeing him drink blood, couldn't bear to remind her of what he was, a predator, a creature of the night, something that should terrify her. He wanted something he couldn't name, a feeling he hadn't experienced in centuries, and it unsettled him profoundly. Clara sat to his right, a decorative accessory to the throne, a silent testament to his victory. The space between their chairs felt like a mile of frozen tundra. His indifference was a wall of ice, so absolute it was almost a physical force, pressing the air from her lungs. She learned to sit without moving, to exist without being. It was a skill she had perfected over 3 long weeks. Her only solace was the castle library, a vast circular chamber filled with the scent of old leather and dried ink. It was the one place no one seemed to bother her. The ancient tomes were her silent companions, volumes on vampire lineages, the history of the blood wars, forbidden grimoires of dark magic. She would trace the faded gilt on their spines, her fingers whispering over forgotten histories, losing herself in worlds far from her own. It was a fragile piece, but it was hers. It was in the library that the first crack appeared in the frozen surface of her new life. She was reaching for a slim volume of poetry on a high shelf, her fingers just brushing the spine, when a shadow fell over her. "Need assistance, princess?" The voice was thick with a familiar, lazy cruelty. It was Marcus, one of the king's personal guard, a vampire of middling age, perhaps 4 centuries turned, whose sneer was a permanent fixture on his too perfect face. He was always near when she felt most alone, a silent, contemptuous sentinel. Before she could refuse, his hand clamped around her upper arm, his grip brutally tight with supernatural strength. He easily plucked the book from the shelf and held it out to her, his crimson eyes glinting with something ugly. "There you are," he said, his voice a low mockery. "Wouldn't want you to strain yourself, mortal." His fingers dug into the soft flesh of her arm, a deliberate, punishing pressure. A jolt of fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron forged in hell's own furnace. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a thin thread. "You can let go now." He held on for a beat longer, his thumb grinding into her bicep with inhuman force, a clear and deliberate assertion of power. He was reminding her of what she was, a possession, a thing, breakable and without recourse. A fragile mortal in a nest of immortal predators. Finally, he released her, his lips curling into a smug smile that revealed the barest hint of fang. He gave a slight, mocking bow and sauntered away, leaving her trembling, the book clutched to her chest like a shield. What Clara didn't know was that Julian had departed on the very night of the library incident, called away to the eastern borders where territorial disputes required the king's personal intervention. Rogue vampires had been hunting in forbidden territories, violating the careful treaties that kept their kind from drawing too much mortal attention. For 3 days and nights he'd been absent from the keep, dealing with the transgressors with swift and brutal efficiency. He'd hated leaving, hated the strange, irrational anxiety that gnawed at him while away from her, an unfamiliar feeling of incompleteness that made no sense for a king who'd ruled alone for centuries. It was absurd. She was merely a treaty obligation. Yet the discomfort persisted, a constant low hum of wrongness that he couldn't shake. Later, in the privacy of her chambers, she pushed up the sleeve of her gown. A dark, ugly bruise was already blooming on her skin, the distinct shape of a hand, 5-petaled and violet-edged, but darker and more vivid than any natural bruise should be. The mark of a vampire's grip, supernaturally strong. A hot tide of shame washed over her. It was a mark of her powerlessness, a visible stain of her humiliation. She pulled the sleeve down quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would say nothing. To whom would she complain? To the vampire king who looked through her as if she were glass? To the court of immortals who despised her mortal blood? To do so would be to invite more scorn, to confirm her status as a weak, troublesome foreigner. The bruise was her secret, another small, bitter truth to be swallowed and hidden away in the silent chambers of her heart. The peace of the kingdom was a delicate, newborn thing. She would not be the one to endanger it with her own small pains. She was the treaty, and a treaty could not afford to bleed. For 2 days she kept the sleeve of her gown pulled low, the ache in her arm a constant, dull reminder. The bruise had darkened impossibly. Vampire-inflicted injuries healed slower than natural wounds, the supernatural damage leaving marks that lingered far longer than mortal bruises. It was as if Marcus's touch had left not just physical damage, but a shadow of his vampiric essence embedded in her flesh, a contamination that her mortal body struggled to purge. She moved through the castle with an even more pronounced quietness, her shoulders hunched as if to physically shrink herself, to take up less space, to offer less of a target. The encounter had stripped away the last of her fragile composure, leaving behind a raw, skittish fear. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Marcus. Every passing vampire made her flinch. When Julian returned to the keep on the second evening after the incident, something felt wrong. He couldn't identify it immediately, just an instinctive sense that the atmosphere had shifted in his absence. Clara seemed different when he saw her briefly in the corridor, more withdrawn, more frightened. The light that he'd secretly cherished, the quiet defiance that kept her spine straight despite the court's cruelty, had dimmed. He'd wanted to approach her, to ask what had changed, but his pride and his carefully maintained distance prevented it. He told himself it was none of his concern. She was adjusting to her new life, that was all. But the wrongness persisted, a growing unease that he couldn't shake, and he found himself altering his movements through the keep to pass by her more frequently, trying to understand what had changed. On the third day after the incident, a shift in protocol forced them together. A delegation from a neutral vampire territory had arrived, and their customs required a formal greeting from both the vampire king and his consort. A thrall, her face a carefully blank mask, informed Clara that she was to join the king in the western gallery to await their arrival. The gallery was a long, echoing hall, lined with portraits of Julian's progenitors and predecessors, a grim collection of stern-faced immortals with the same blood-red eyes as their descendant. The air was frigid, smelling of stone and old iron. Julian was already there, standing before a vast window that overlooked the winding road leading up to Sanguine Keep. He was a silhouette against the harsh gray light of the perpetually overcast sky, immense and unmoving, perfectly still in the way only the undead could be. He did not turn as she approached, his attention fixed on the procession of carriages making their slow way up the mountain. Clara stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. It was the closest she had been to him since their wedding day. She could feel no warmth from his body. Vampires had no body heat to give, only a strange, magnetic pull, like standing near the mouth of an abyss. It was like being in the presence of a beautiful, sentient void. "They will be here within the hour," he said, his voice a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the stone itself. It was the first time he had addressed her directly in weeks, and the sound of his voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She used his formal title, not daring the intimacy of his name. He finally turned, and the moment his burgundy eyes met hers, something shifted in the air between them. For the first time, he truly looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. His gaze swept over her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw something flicker in those ancient eyes. Concern. Awareness. Something almost tender beneath the predatory stillness. His eyes moved from the careful coil of her hair to the hem of her gray gown, and then, with the enhanced perception of his kind, they stopped on her arm. Even through the fabric he could sense it. The irregularity, the damage, the lingering taint of another vampire's touch, the mark of violence against her skin. It was a small thing, a nervous gesture. In her anxiety, she had been rubbing her bruised arm through the fabric of her sleeve, and in that moment, she had let the sleeve ride up just an inch, no more. But it was enough. Against the pale skin of her wrist, the dark, discolored edge of the bruise was a stark, unmissable declaration. The air in the gallery changed. It thickened, grew heavy, charged with a sudden, terrible energy. Julian's stillness became absolute, the focused calm of an apex predator scenting prey. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively flinched back, her heart seizing in her chest. The movement was a mistake. It was an admission of fear, and his eyes narrowed, the burgundy darkening to the color of dried blood. But beneath the fury building in his chest was something else, something that felt like his dead heart trying to beat again. She was afraid. She was hurt. And the realization that someone had dared to harm her, that she had suffered in silence for days while he'd been away, filled him with a rage unlike anything he'd felt in centuries. This wasn't the cold anger of a king whose property had been damaged. This was something far more visceral, far more personal. This was the fury of a male whose mate had been threatened. The thought stopped him cold. Mate? Where had that come from? She was mortal, temporary. She would age and die while he remained eternal. There could be no future there. And yet the word resonated in his mind with the force of absolute truth. "Show me your arm," he commanded. The words were not loud, but they held a terrifying weight, a power that permitted no disobedience. It was the voice of a king who had ruled for centuries, a voice that had ordered executions and conquests, a voice that had never known denial. Her breath hitched. "It is nothing, Your Majesty. A clumsy mistake." She tried to pull her sleeve down, to hide the evidence of her shame. He moved with the inhuman speed of his kind, covering the distance between them in a blur. His hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering just inches from her arm. His fingers were pale as marble, the nails perfectly manicured, but somehow suggesting claws. "Show me," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried an undercurrent of desperate concern. "Please." That last word, "please," spoken by a king who commanded, not asked, made her hands tremble as she slowly pushed up the sleeve. The bruise was a hideous marring of her skin, a clear, brutal handprint stark against the white. The edges darkened to an unnatural purple-black. The signature of vampire strength, the unmistakable pattern of 5 fingers pressed with inhuman force. Julian stared at it, his face utterly devoid of expression. But something flickered in the depths of his eyes, a red glow, ancient and feral, the beast that lived beneath the civilized veneer. And beneath that beast, something broke. 7 centuries of careful control, of measured indifference, of convincing himself he was beyond such mortal concerns as love or attachment, all of it shattered at the sight of those 5 dark fingerprints on her pale skin. She was his. Not in the way a king possessed a treaty or a territory. She was his in the way that made his ancient blood sing with recognition. She was the warmth he'd forgotten he craved, the heartbeat that called to his stillness, the life that made his death feel like a curse instead of power. The silence that followed was the most terrifying she had ever known. It was the silence of a coming storm, the deep, indrawn breath before the lightning strike. He did not look at her face. His gaze remained fixed on the mark, as if he were memorizing every detail of its shape and color. He was a vampire king. He was an immortal predator. His entire existence was built on the recognition of territory, of possession, of the ancient laws of blood and dominion. And what he was looking at was the mark of another vampire, laid on what was his. Not his wife, not his queen, not even a person. His. A piece of his territory that had been defiled. A mortal under his protection who had been harmed by one of his own kind. No, that wasn't it. That wasn't the burning fury in his chest. She wasn't territory. She was everything. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were no longer the muted burgundy of controlled hunger. They were glowing, a deep crimson fire burning from within. The eyes of the beast, the ancient vampire unleashed. The indifference was gone, incinerated in a flash of pure primal fury. The civilized king was gone, and in his place was the monster, the blood drinker, the immortal lord of darkness who had just discovered that someone had dared to touch what he'd foolishly tried to convince himself he didn't want. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice a low, deadly growl that promised retribution spanning centuries. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up, and the name was trapped behind her teeth. She just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, tears of fear, not of pain. He didn't need her to answer. He reached out, and with a gentleness that was utterly incongruous with the rage pouring off him in waves, a cold, dark energy that made the very air feel heavy, he took her arm. His fingers, cold as death itself, brushed against the edges of the bruise, his touch so light it was barely there, as if she were made of spun glass, and he feared shattering her. But she felt it like a brand, like a promise, like a vow written in ice and shadow. "I will kill him," he said softly, almost conversationally, his thumb tracing the edge of the bruise with infinite care. "I will tear his heart from his chest and scatter his ashes to the wind. And then I will hunt down every vampire in this keep who looked at you with contempt, who made you feel less than the treasure you are, and I will remind them what happens when they forget their place." The words should have terrified her. Instead, something warm bloomed in her chest, the first warmth she'd felt since arriving in this cold, dark place. He saw her, truly saw her, and the fury in his eyes wasn't the anger of a king whose possession had been damaged. It was something far more primal, far more personal. He lowered her arm, carefully pulling the sleeve back into place, his movements precise and deliberate. Each touch a silent apology for his blindness, for his absence when she needed protection, for the weeks she'd suffered alone. Then he turned, his hand closing around her elbow with a grip that was iron strong, yet carefully calibrated not to hurt her, and began to walk, pulling her with him. He was not rough, but his grip was an unbreakable manacle. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her feet stumbling to keep up with his long, purposeful strides. "To hold court," he said, the words clipping off like shards of ice. "To remind my coven of something they seem to have forgotten. To claim what is mine. To protect what I should have protected from the beginning." He did not lead her to the throne room. He swept into the great hall, the massive doors groaning open before them as if commanded by his will alone. The conclave was already assembled for the evening gathering, the long tables filled with the ranking members of his coven, elder vampires, lesser nobles, warriors who had fought in the blood wars. The sound of conversation and the clink of crystal goblets filled the cavernous space, echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. It all stopped the moment Julian entered. A wave of silence rolled through the hall as every head turned towards them, every pair of crimson eyes locking onto their king. They saw their liege, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes glowing with barely contained violence, and they saw the pale, terrified mortal he was all but dragging in his wake. He did not go to the high table. He stopped in the center of the hall, the focal point of 100 pairs of suddenly wary, ancient eyes. His gaze swept the room, a predator scanning his domain. "Marcus!" he called out. The name was a whipcrack in the sudden, absolute silence. His voice carried the weight of centuries, the authority of the first blood. From a table near the back, the vampire guard stood up. Marcus's face was a mixture of confusion and his usual arrogance. He clearly had no idea what was happening. He thought he was being singled out for some honor, some duty. He swaggered forward, a smirk playing on his too perfect lips. "My king?" Julian released Clara's arm, positioning her slightly behind him with a possessive, protective movement that spoke volumes to those who watched. He looked at the approaching vampire, his glowing eyes flat and merciless. "3 nights passed," Julian said, his voice resonating with a dangerous calm. "You were on duty in the royal library." Marcus's smirk faltered. A flicker of unease crossed his face. "I was, my king." "You assisted the princess," Julian continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with a deadly undercurrent. "I did, my king. She required help reaching a tome." He was regaining his confidence, puffing out his chest. He glanced at Clara, a flicker of contempt in his crimson eyes, as if to say, "See, the little mortal went crying to him." Julian took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop further, frost beginning to form on the surface of the nearest goblets. "Show me your hands, Marcus." The guard, confused but obedient, held out his hands, pale, perfect, strong. Julian looked down at them, then back up at Marcus's face. "It is the sworn duty of every vampire in my service to protect the royal house, to shield them from harm, to lay down their very existence for them if necessary. This is the blood oath you swore when you entered my guard." "It is, my king," Marcus affirmed, his voice ringing with false piety. "And what is the penalty?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more terrifying than any shout. "For one who breaks that oath. For a vampire who harms those under the crown's protection. For one who dares to touch what belongs to me." The blood, what little flowed through an undead body, drained from Marcus's face, leaving him even paler, almost translucent. The full, horrific understanding of his situation finally dawned on him. His eyes darted to Clara, then back to the unyielding fury in his king's glowing gaze. He started to stammer, to back away. "My king, it was nothing, a misunderstanding. She is merely a mortal, He never finished the sentence. Julian moved with a speed that defied mortal comprehension, a blur of shadow and violence. One moment he was standing still, the next his hand was locked around Marcus's throat, lifting the younger vampire clear off the floor. Marcus's feet kicked uselessly in the air, his hands clawing at the iron grip crushing his throat. A collective gasp went through the hall. No one moved. No one dared. They were witnessing the wrath of the first blood, the ancient fury of a king defending what was his. Julian's other hand rose, and for the first time, Clara saw the true nature of his kind. His fingernails elongated, thickening into vicious black talons that gleamed like obsidian blades. His lips pulled back, revealing elongated fangs, sharp and deadly, instruments of death that had ended countless lives over his long immortal existence. The civilized veneer was gone. This was the vampire king, the apex predator, the monster from mortal nightmares. But to Clara, watching from behind him, he was something else entirely. He was beautiful. Terrifying, yes, but beautiful in his fury, in his protection, in the way he'd transformed from cold indifference to this blazing, consuming need to defend her. For the first time since arriving in this dark court, she didn't feel alone. "She is your queen," Julian snarled, his voice a guttural, inhuman sound. He leaned in close, his fangs mere inches from Marcus's face, his words for the condemned vampire alone, but his rage was a palpable force that filled the entire hall. "And you dared to lay your filthy hands on her. You violated the blood oath. You dishonored the crown. You harmed what is mine. You touched her. And for that, there is only one penalty: the final death." There was a sickening, wet sound, the sound of talons piercing dead flesh and tearing through the unnatural sinew that held a vampire's body together. Marcus's body went rigid, his mouth opening in a silent scream as Julian's claws pierced his chest. But Julian didn't stop. With a brutal, savage motion he tore, rending flesh and bone. For a vampire, true death came not from a stake to the heart, but from complete destruction. Julian's hand emerged from Marcus's chest cavity holding something dark and withered, the vampire's desiccated heart, the one organ that still held a shadow of their former life. Julian held Marcus's gaze as he crushed the heart in his fist, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper meant only for the dying vampire. "She is mine, in every way that matters, and I will destroy anyone who forgets it." The heart crumbled to ash, black dust falling through his fingers like sand. Marcus's body convulsed once, twice, then began to disintegrate. The unnatural animation that held a vampire's form together failed, and Marcus crumbled to ash, his body collapsing into a pile of gray dust on the flagstones, his clothes settling on top like a funeral shroud. It was the final death, the true end for the undead. There would be no rising, no resurrection. Marcus was gone, erased from existence by the will of his king. The silence in the hall was absolute, a profound, ringing void. It was the silence of utter terror. Every vampire in the room was frozen, their faces pale with shock and primal fear. Even the eldest among them, those who had walked the earth for centuries, looked at their king with newfound dread. Clara stood behind Julian, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide not with horror, but with something else. Wonder, perhaps. Awe. The terrifying realization that this ancient, powerful creature had just destroyed one of his own for her. Julian paid no mind to the remains. He turned his gaze upon his terrified conclave, his eyes still glowing that terrible crimson. His talons retracted, his fangs receding, but the aura of violence clung to him like a shroud. He stalked toward the high table, where a scribe had left the official treaty documents, the painstakingly calligraphed pages that bound their two kingdoms in peace. The papers were tied with a silken ribbon, the wax seal of her father's house still intact. They were the reason she was here. They were the source of her supposed safety. He snatched them up. The council members nearest to him flinched back as if he were about to strike. He walked to the great central hearth, where flames burned eternally, fed by magic and kept burning through the centuries. Without a word, he tossed the entire bundle into the flames. The dry parchment curled instantly, the edges blackening before bursting into bright, hungry orange. The wax seal melted, dripping like a tear of blood before being consumed. In seconds, the treaty that had ended a decade of war was reduced to a flurry of gray ash, joining the remains of Marcus in oblivion. A choked sound of protest came from one of the elder vampires, a lord named Valerius, who had sat on the conclave for 3 centuries. "My king! The peace! The covenant of blood!" Julian whirled around, his eyes locking on the elder vampire. "You thought her safety relied on this paper?" he snarled, the sound echoing in the horrified stillness. His voice was a whip, lashing every being in the hall. "You thought a mortal treaty held more weight than my word, than my claim, than my love?" The last word hung in the air, shocking in its unexpectedness. Julian's eyes widened slightly, as if he'd surprised himself. As if the word had been torn from some deep place he'd thought long dead. Love. He loved her. When had that happened? How had this mortal, this fragile, temporary creature worked her way past 7 centuries of carefully constructed emotional distance? He looked back at Clara, their eyes meeting across the hall. And in that moment, she saw the truth in his ancient gaze. Not just possession, not just protection. Love. Raw, fierce, eternal love from a creature who'd thought himself incapable of it. He strode back to her, his movements swift and predatory, and pulled her from behind him to his side, his arm wrapped around her waist, a possessive, unyielding band of supernatural strength, holding her fast against his cold body. She was trembling, but not with fear, with something else, something that made her heart race and her skin flush with warmth. "Her safety relies on me," he declared, his voice thundering through the hall, carrying the weight of ancient power. He looked out at the sea of pale, frightened faces, his gaze lingering on each and every one of them, burning his message into their immortal minds. She is no longer a political tribute. She is no longer the Valley Princess. She is your queen, sanctified by my blood, protected by my dominion, cherished by my heart. And this is my one and only warning, spoken once and never repeated. Anyone who touches her, anyone who insults her, anyone who even looks at her with disrespect, will face the final death. I will tear the heart from their chest myself and scatter their ashes to the wind. The blood oath extends to her. She is mine, and what is mine, I protect unto the ending of the world. She is mine, and I am hers. For as long as her mortal heart beats, and beyond, should she wish it. The implication of those last words sent a ripple through the court. Beyond. He was offering her eternity, offering her immortality, offering her a place at his side not for the brief span of a mortal life, but forever. He let the declaration hang in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. The silence that answered him was one of complete and terrified submission. The court had seen her as a symbol of a peace they resented, a mortal weakness in their immortal king. Julian had just made her a symbol of his power, and his wrath, and his love. He had not just executed a vampire, he had executed their contempt. He had burned the treaty to prove that her life was not a matter of politics, but a matter of his will, his blood right, his eternal dominion, his heart. Without another word, he turned, his arms still locked around her, and pulled her from the great hall. He moved with the same relentless purpose as before, his strides long and sure. Clara could do nothing but let herself be towed along in his wake, her mind a maelstrom of shock and wonder, and something that felt dangerously like hope. The great doors boomed shut behind them, sealing them away from the scene of carnage and the court he had just bludgeoned into submission. Behind them, Lord Valerius moved with the practiced efficiency of one who had managed crises for 3 centuries. The delegation would be handled. They would be shown to their quarters, given refreshments, and quietly informed that the Queen had been elevated beyond mere political consideration. They would witness the ashes on the floor, hear the whispered accounts of what had transpired, and return to their own territories with a very clear message. The Vampire King's consort was untouchable, sacred, beloved, and the peace held not on paper, but on his absolute, terrifying will. By the next evening, word would spread across all vampire territories. By the week's end, it would reach the mortal kingdoms. Clara's father would receive a message sealed with Julian's personal sigil, informing him that the treaty was void, but the peace held, guaranteed by something far stronger than parchment, guaranteed by the oath and blood of an immortal king whose daughter was now his cherished queen rather than a political hostage. Her father, understanding he could not stand against the united power of the vampire court, would accept this new reality. Having his bloodline connected to an immortal king was worth far more than any treaty. Julian did not take Clara back to her own cold, isolated chambers. He guided her through unfamiliar corridors, up a winding stone staircase that seemed to climb into the very heart of the mountain. The air grew less frigidly cold, the tapestries on the walls richer, older, embroidered with scenes from vampire history spanning millennia. He was taking her to his own domain, the King's Wing of Sanguine Keep, the inner sanctum where only the most trusted were permitted. He stopped before a set of massive iron-bound oak doors carved with ancient runes of protection and dominion, and pushed them open. He led her inside and finally released her. The chamber was vast, dominated by a hearth that burned with an eternal flame. Tapestries depicting the night sky and crescent moons hung on the walls. The air smelled of him, of cold stone, old leather, and something else, something dark and indefinable, the scent of immortality itself. It was a fiercely powerful space, the den of a king who had ruled for centuries. The chamber had never contained a bed before Clara. Vampires had no need for sleep, and Julian had spent centuries in contemplative stillness, standing at his window or sitting in profound meditation. And he had just brought her into it. Clara didn't back away this time. She stood in the center of the room, her heart racing, her eyes locked on his. The terror had transformed into something else, into understanding, into recognition of what she'd seen in his eyes when he'd looked at her in the hall. Julian watched her, his expression unreadable for a long moment, his chest not rising or falling. He had no need to breathe, but the tension in his body was palpable. The fury had burned away, leaving something raw and vulnerable in its wake. He ran a hand through his long, dark hair, a gesture of profound agitation. "I frighten you," he said finally, his voice rough. "No," she replied, surprising them both. "Not anymore." He looked at her, genuinely startled. "I just tore a vampire's heart from his chest in front of you. I burned a treaty that was meant to protect you. I claimed you before the entire court like a beast claiming territory." "Like a male protecting his mate," she corrected softly, using the term that had flickered through his mind in the gallery. She took a step toward him. "I felt your indifference for weeks. I watched you look through me as if I didn't exist. But tonight you saw me, truly saw me. And what you did, it wasn't the act of a king protecting a political asset. It was something else, something more." Julian remained utterly still, every muscle in his immortal body locked tight, as if movement would shatter the fragile moment between them. "I told myself I accepted you as a treaty term, a political necessity. I told myself I would keep you at a distance, that it was kinder that way. You're mortal, fragile, temporary. I am eternal darkness. I am death given form. I convinced myself I felt nothing." "And now?" Clara asked, closing the distance between them until she stood directly before him, close enough to feel the cold radiating from his body, close enough to see the torment in his ancient eyes. "Now I know I was lying to myself," he admitted, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "I watched you. For weeks I told myself I was simply observing, ensuring you were settling in. But I was haunting the shadows like a lovesick fool, memorizing the way you move, the sound of your voice, the way you touch books as if they're precious treasures. I found myself drawn to your chambers in the hours when you slept, unable to settle into my usual meditative state, listening to your heartbeat, letting the sound of your life soothe my death." He reached out, his cold fingers brushing her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I am 700 years old, Clara. I have commanded armies, I have toppled kingdoms. I have walked through centuries, untouched, unmoved, convinced I was beyond such mortal weaknesses as love. And then you arrived, with your stubborn pride and your kind heart, and your refusal to break under the weight of my court's cruelty, and you destroyed 7 centuries of carefully constructed emotional distance in a matter of weeks." His thumb traced her jaw, his touch worshipful. "When I saw that bruise on your arm, when I realized you'd been suffering in silence while I was away, that someone had dared to harm you, something in me broke. Or perhaps it awakened. I don't know anymore. All I know is that you are mine. Not as a possession, not as a treaty. You are mine the way the moon belongs to the night, the way stars belong to the darkness. You are the warmth I'd forgotten I craved. You are the life that makes my death feel like a curse. You are everything." Clara's breath caught. Tears pricked her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of his confession. This ancient, powerful creature, this king of darkness, was standing before her with his heart, his long-dead heart, laid bare. "I'm mortal," she whispered. "I'll age. I'll die. You'll remain eternal, unchanging. How can you love something so temporary?" "All the more reason to cherish every moment," Julian replied, his other hand coming up to cup her face, cradling it between his cold palms. "Every heartbeat, every breath, every sunrise you see that I cannot. I would rather have 30 years of your warmth than an eternity of cold solitude. Unless—" He hesitated, and she saw vulnerability flash across his perfect features. "Unless you choose otherwise. The words I spoke in the hall, I meant them. I can offer you eternity, Clara. I can turn you, make you as I am. Immortal, eternal. You would never age, never die, never leave me. But I will not force it. I will not steal your mortality from you. It must be your choice." Clara's mind reeled. Immortality, eternity, an endless existence as a vampire, as his queen, as his mate. To leave behind the warm blood and beating heart of her humanity, to become something else, something other, something eternal. She started, but he pressed a finger gently to her lips. "Do not answer now," he murmured. "This is not a decision to be made in the aftermath of violence and revelation. Live first. Learn what it means to be my queen. Learn whether you can love a monster as I love you. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, the offer will remain. For now, I ask only this. Stay with me. Be mine. Let me court you as I should have from the beginning. Let me show you that I can be more than cold indifference and brutal violence. Let me love you, Clara, in whatever time we have." The words broke something open in her chest. This fearsome vampire king, this apex predator, was asking, not commanding. Was offering, not demanding. Was loving, not possessing. "Yes," she whispered against his finger. "Yes to all of it." Julian's eyes blazed, and then he was kissing her, his cold lips claiming hers with a desperate hunger that spoke of weeks of denial, of centuries of loneliness, of the sudden, overwhelming joy of finding something precious he'd thought forever lost to him. His kiss was ice and fire, death and life, eternal darkness and the promise of forever. Clara melted into him, her warm hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer despite the cold of his body, or perhaps because of it. The contrast was intoxicating. Her heat, his chill, her life, his death, her mortality, his eternity, all colliding in a kiss that felt like the sealing of a vow. When he finally pulled back, his eyes had darkened to that deep burgundy, his fangs slightly elongated with the intensity of his emotion. But there was no danger there, only desire, only love, only the fierce possessiveness of a male who had finally, after centuries, found his mate. "You should know," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple, her cheek, the pulse point at her throat. lingering there, reverent, controlled. I am not an easy creature to love. I am darkness and cold. I am death. I will love you with an intensity that may terrify you. I will be possessive and jealous and fiercely protective. I will want to keep you safe, even when it means being overbearing. I am old and set in my ways, and I will make mistakes. And you should know, Clara replied, her hands sliding up to thread through his long, dark hair. I am not as fragile as you think. I survived a war. I survived your court's cruelty. I survived weeks of your indifference. I am stronger than I look. And I am stubborn enough to love you, despite your certainty that you don't deserve it. A sound escaped him, almost a laugh, rusty with disuse. When did you become so brave? When I watched the Vampire King tear a man's heart out for daring to bruise me, she replied with a small smile. It's surprisingly empowering to see the monster become your champion. I am your monster, Julian murmured against her hair, holding her close, savoring the warmth of her body against his cold one. Yours alone, for as long as you'll have me. Then it seems I have quite the dangerous pet, Clara teased, and felt him smile against her skin. Careful, my queen, he warned playfully, his voice a low rumble. This pet has teeth. I've noticed, she replied, tilting her head to give him better access to her throat, a gesture of trust that made him inhale sharply, unnecessarily, instinctively. I'm not afraid. You should be, he whispered, his lips ghosting over her pulse. I want to taste you. I want to claim you in every way my kind claims their mates. I want to bind you to me so thoroughly that every vampire in this realm knows you are mine. But I will not. Not until you ask. Not until you're ready. Not until you understand fully what it means. Clara shivered, not with fear but with anticipation. Then court me, Julian. Show me what it means to be loved by a vampire king. And when I'm ready, if I'm ready, I'll tell you. If? He questioned, pulling back to look at her, a hint of vulnerability in his ancient eyes. When, she corrected, her smile growing. When I'm ready, I'll ask you to turn me. I'll ask you to make me yours for eternity. Because I think I've been falling in love with you since the wedding, when I saw that flicker in your eyes, that moment when you looked at me and I saw something stir in you. I told myself I was imagining it, but I wasn't, was I? No, Julian admitted, his thumb tracing her lower lip with infinite gentleness. You weren't. I saw you standing there in your winter silks, looking so brave and terrified all at once, and something in my dead chest ached. I didn't understand it then. I fought it for weeks, but there was never really any question. You were always meant to be mine, Clara. From the moment you stepped into my hall, you became the only thing in 7 centuries that's made me feel alive. He kissed her again, softer this time, slower, a kiss that was a promise of countless more to come. When he pulled back, his eyes had returned to their normal burgundy, his expression tender in a way that transformed his harsh features into something beautiful. Come, he said, taking her hand. Let me show you what it means to be the queen of this realm. Let me show you the keep in a way you've never seen it. Let me court you properly, as you deserve. We have time. How much time? Clara asked as he led her toward the door. Julian paused, looking back at her with an expression of fierce determination. However much you want. If you choose mortality, I will cherish every moment of your human life and mourn your loss for eternity. If you choose to turn, then we have forever. The choice, my darling Clara, is always yours. As they stepped into the corridor together, hand in hand, the Vampire King and his mortal queen, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since arriving at Sanguine Keep. Hope. And beneath that hope, a growing certainty. She would choose eternity, not because she feared death, but because she wanted forever with this ancient, dangerous, surprisingly tender creature who had looked at her like she was the only light in his eternal darkness. 3 months passed, and the transformation of Clara's life at Sanguine Keep had been gradual but profound. Julian had kept his word. He courted her with an intensity and devotion that took her breath away. He had a bed made for her, positioned near the eternal hearth where it was warmest, with the finest silks and furs to keep away the mountain chill. He would remain in his chamber through her sleeping hours, watching over her with the stillness only the undead could achieve, content to guard her dreams, even as his own rest remained forever beyond reach. Most evenings, when she woke with the setting sun, he would be there, sitting in contemplation, and he would turn to her with an expression of such tender welcome that her heart would flutter. Every night, for nights were when the court lived, and she had adjusted her schedule accordingly, he found new ways to show her his world, to share with her the wonders of immortal existence. He took her to the highest tower at midnight to watch the aurora dance across the northern sky. He showed her the ancient archives beneath the keep, where the history of his kind stretched back millennia, scrolls and tomes that predated human civilization. He taught her the politics of vampire society, treating her not as an ornament but as his equal, his partner in rule. He introduced her to the concept of blood bonds, of vampire mates, of the ancient magic that connected his kind. And he loved her. With a fierce, possessive devotion that should have been frightening, but instead made her feel cherished beyond measure. He had finally allowed her to see him feed, from crystal goblets filled by willing thralls, never taking more than offered, always with consent and respect. She'd watched, fascinated rather than horrified, at this glimpse into his true nature. He'd been tense, watching her reaction, but she'd simply taken his hand and told him she was not afraid of what he was. "You are a vampire," she'd said. "It's not something to hide from me. I want to know all of you." The court had transformed around her, at least on the surface. The whispers had been silenced by fear, replaced by outward deference that was absolute and non-negotiable. Some of the vampires, particularly the younger ones and those who valued survival over pride, had begun to show genuine respect as they witnessed her intelligence in council meetings and her compassion toward the thralls. But Clara wasn't naive. She could sense the resentment that still simmered beneath the surface among some of the older vampires, those who'd lived for centuries and didn't appreciate being cowed by their king's attachment to a former mortal. They were careful, though. They'd seen what happened to Marcus. They knew Julian's wrath was absolute when it came to her. So they bowed, they smiled, they showed courtesy, and if hatred burned behind their crimson eyes, they kept it hidden. It was enough. She didn't need their love. She had Julian's. And she had their fear, which in the vampire world was often more valuable than affection. She'd proven herself clever in council meetings, compassionate in dealing with disputes, and utterly fearless when defending those under her protection. She'd taken several thralls under her personal patronage, improving their living conditions and ensuring they were treated with dignity. She'd established a school for the mortal children born in the keep's surrounding villages. She was no longer just the treaty bride. She was their queen in truth. And every night, Julian courted her with patient devotion. He kissed her, touched her, held her close, but always stopped before going further. "When you're ready," he would whisper against her skin. "When you choose eternity, I will claim you fully, but not before. I will not bind you to me in every way until you've decided to stay forever." It was an old-fashioned notion, perhaps, but it spoke to his essential nature, honorable despite his darkness, protective despite his power. Clara had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with him. With his unexpected gentleness, his dry humor that emerged once he'd allowed himself to relax around her, his fierce intelligence, his unwavering devotion. The way he listened when she spoke, as if her words were precious. The way he looked at her as if she were the only thing of value in his ancient world. She'd made her decision weeks ago, but she'd waited, wanting to be absolutely certain. Tonight, she was ready. She waited in their shared chambers, for she'd moved into his rooms permanently after the first month. When Julian entered near midnight, returning from a council meeting, he found her standing by the window, dressed in a gown of deep crimson, his color, the color of his eyes, the color of blood and passion and eternity. Clara? He questioned, sensing immediately that something was different. What is it? She turned to face him, her expression calm, resolved, radiant with certainty. I've made my decision. Julian went completely still, every muscle in his immortal body locking down. Your decision? His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the hope and fear warring in his eyes. About eternity, Clara said, crossing to him, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. About immortality. About spending forever as your mate, your queen, your equal in darkness. Clara, he started, his voice rough. I want you to turn me, she said, clearly, firmly. Tonight, now. I want to become as you are. I want eternity with you, Julian. I want forever. Julian's eyes blazed crimson, the beast surging forward at her words, at the offer of everything he'd wanted but been afraid to hope for. Are you certain? He demanded, his hands gripping hers almost painfully tight. Once done, it cannot be undone. You will be vampire. You will leave your humanity behind. You will never see sunlight again, never taste mortal food, never age, never die, never leave you, Clara finished. I know what I'm choosing, Julian. I've spent 3 months learning your world. I've watched you, learned from you, loved you. I'm not afraid. I'm ready. Make me yours, in every way, forever. A shudder ran through him, and then he was pulling her close, his face buried in her hair, his voice breaking with emotion he could no longer contain. I love you. I love you beyond reason, beyond sanity, beyond the capacity of words to express. You are my heart, Clara. The only one I've had in 7 centuries. Then give me eternity, she whispered. Love me forever. Julian pulled back, his eyes molten red, his fangs fully extended now. But there was no danger there, only desire, only love, only the fierce joy of a male about to claim his mate for eternity. The turning is intense. It will hurt. I will have to drain you to the point of death, then feed you my blood. You will die, in truth, and be reborn. I will be with you every moment, but I cannot take the pain away. I'm not afraid, Clara said again, tilting her head to expose her throat, that elegant column of pale skin he'd been obsessing over for months, the pulse point he'd dreamed of tasting. I trust you. I love you. Make me yours, Julian. Make me eternal. With a growl that was more feeling than sound, Julian swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed. He laid her down on the dark silk sheets, his hands shaking slightly with the force of his restraint. Once I start, he warned, kneeling beside her, his fingers trailing down the side of her neck, I won't be able to stop until it's done. The bloodlust will take me. I need you to trust that I will stop before I take too much, that I will give you my blood, that I will see you through the transformation. I trust you, Clara said simply, reaching up to cup his face. Completely. Something in Julian's expression cracked at that, the absolute trust in her eyes, the unwavering faith. He leaned down, his lips brushing her throat, his voice a reverent whisper. I will love you for eternity, Clara. This I vow on my blood, on my immortal soul. You are mine, and I am yours, from this moment until the ending of all things. Forever, Clara agreed, her fingers threading through his hair. And then he struck. The pain was immediate, intense, but somehow not as terrible as she'd feared. His fangs pierced her throat with supernatural precision, and the sensation was shock and pressure and a strange, dark pleasure all mingled together. She could feel her blood leaving her body, flowing into him, could feel her life force dimming. But she could also feel his love through the connection, his fierce, possessive devotion, his wonder that she'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen forever. The world began to gray at the edges. Her heartbeat, so strong and steady, began to slow, slower, weaker, a dying rhythm. Her warm blood cooled. Her breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. The darkness pulled at her, welcoming, final. Her heart gave one last struggling beat, then silence. Complete, absolute silence in her chest. She was dead. And just as the final darkness began to claim her, Julian withdrew. His wrist was already torn open, blood welling dark and rich from the wound. He pressed it to her cooling lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion and desperate love. "Drink, my Clara. Come back to me. Be reborn as mine." At first, nothing. Her body was still, lifeless, a beautiful corpse. Then, instinct, magic, the ancient power in his blood, her mouth moved. She drank. The taste of his blood was like nothing she'd ever experienced. Dark, rich, ancient, powerful. It burned going down, a fire in her dead chest that spread through her veins like liquid lightning. Her silent heart trembled, then convulsed. Not beating, vampires didn't have beating hearts, but transforming, changing, becoming something new. She drank deeply, greedily, her hands coming up to grip his wrist, holding it to her mouth as her body was remade. Her senses exploded. She could hear everything, the crackle of the eternal flame, the whisper of wind outside the tower, the conversations happening in the hall 3 floors below. She could smell everything, the age of the stone, the magic in the air, the lingering scent of blood and life and death. She could feel everything with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. And when she finally released his wrist and opened her eyes, the world had changed. Colors were different, sharper, more vivid despite the darkness of the room. She could see in the shadows as clearly as if they were illuminated by full sun. She could feel the power thrumming through her newly immortal body, the strength, the speed, the inhuman grace. She looked up at Julian and saw him clearly for the first time, not with mortal eyes that were limited and dim, but with vampire senses that caught every detail of his ancient beauty. He was magnificent, terrifying, perfect. "Julian," she whispered, and her voice was different, richer, more resonant, carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "Clara," he breathed, his eyes scanning her face with wonder and relief and overwhelming love. "My Clara, my mate, my queen, my eternal companion." She could feel it now, the blood bond between them, a connection that thrummed with life and power and binding magic. She was his, and he was hers, linked in a way that transcended mere mortal marriage. They were vampire mates, bound by blood and soul, eternal. "I can feel you," she said in wonder, her hand pressing to her still, silent chest. "Inside me. Your presence. Your emotions. Is this—" "The mate bond," Julian confirmed, pulling her up into his arms, kissing her deeply, tasting his own blood on her lips mixed with the lingering taste of hers. "It only forms between vampires, when 2 of our kind are bound by blood and love. Before your turning, I felt mortal emotions, love, desire, possessiveness. But there was no supernatural connection between us. I couldn't sense your distress when Marcus harmed you, couldn't feel your pain through any mystical link. I was as blind as any mortal lover, dependent on observation and instinct alone. That was why I failed to see your suffering immediately. But now we are bound. For eternity. I will always know where you are, always feel your emotions, always be connected to you, and you to me. We are one in a way that transcends even the deepest mortal love. This is the mate bond, and it is unbreakable." Clara kissed him back with her newfound vampire strength, and the intensity of it shocked them both. She was no longer fragile, no longer breakable. She was immortal, powerful, eternal. His equal, at last. When they finally broke apart, both caught in the habit of breathing despite not needing to, Julian's eyes were blazing with desire and possessive joy. "You are magnificent," he murmured, his hands roaming over her body, relearning her in this new form. You were beautiful as a mortal, but as a vampire, as my mate, you are devastating. Then claim me, Clara said, her new vampire nature making her bold, hungry, demanding. Fully, completely. You said you would wait until I chose eternity. I've chosen. Now claim your mate, Julian. Make me yours in every way. With a growl of pure male satisfaction, Julian bore her back onto the silk sheets, his hands and mouth worshipping every inch of her newly immortal form. And as he finally claimed her fully, binding them together in body as they were already bound in blood and soul, Clara knew she'd made the right choice. This was where she belonged, in the darkness, in the cold, in the eternal night, in the arms of her vampire king, her mate, her love, her forever. 1 year later, Clara stood on the highest balcony of Sanguine Keep, looking out over the realm that was now truly hers. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead, the moon full and bright. She didn't miss the sun, not anymore. The night held its own beauty, one she could appreciate fully now with her vampire senses. She heard Julian's approach long before he reached her, the silent whisper of his movement, the familiar presence of his consciousness brushing against hers through their mate bond. His arms came around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking, my love?" he murmured against her ear. "That I made the right choice," Clara replied, her hands covering his. "That I'm exactly where I meant to be." "No regrets?" Julian asked, though he could feel her emotions through their bond, could sense the absolute certainty, the profound contentment. "None," Clara said firmly. "I love being vampire. I love the power, the senses, the immortality. I love ruling at your side as your true equal. I love our eternity together. I love you, Julian, more than I thought possible." "And I love you," Julian replied, turning her in his arms so he could look into her eyes, crimson now, like his own, the mark of her vampire nature. "My queen, my mate, my eternal companion. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing this, for choosing us." Clara smiled, her fangs gleaming in the moonlight. She was no longer the frightened mortal princess who'd arrived at Sanguine Keep as a treaty bride. She was queen of the vampires, mate to the most powerful creature in the realm, immortal and eternal and utterly, completely happy. "Thank you for seeing me," she said softly, "for loving me, for giving me forever." "Forever," Julian agreed, kissing her deeply, "and every moment of it is yours." As they stood together on the balcony, two immortal beings bound by blood and love and eternity, the night stretched out before them, endless, beautiful, full of promise. They had forever, and forever had never looked so bright.